So today we're talking about grazing on public lands, and we'd love for you to join the conversation by calling us at 415-663-8492 or tweeting us at Let's Talk on KWMR. And it looks like we have a few calls coming in right now, so be patient. You're in the queue when the phone's ringing, and we'll get to you. Pardon me. And today's discussion about grazing on public lands came about because of what's going on in Oregon with the occupation there. And some of the factors are sort of the two areas are fees, and are the fees too cheap, and why aren't they paying their fees? And secondarily, what are the impacts of grazing on public lands? What are the pros? What are the cons? And how can it be helpful? How is it not a good thing? So I think we've got some callers, Bernie.
We do. Hi, you're on the air. What's your name, please? Hi, first caller. Are you there?
Oh, they may have hung up.
Well, let's go to the other caller. Hi, you're on the air.
Hello.
Yeah, hi, we hear you. What's your name?
Hi, Aaron Lusich.
Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Aaron. Aaron, I know from Holistic Ag, and you've been doing grazing on some privately held land for restoration. Can you give us some of your viewpoints about grazing on public lands?
Yeah.
So Aaron is with Holistic Ag, and they've been, I think it's been 2 years now, Pepperwood Preserve hired them or asked them to come because they wanted to restore native grasses in the preserve. It's in Sonoma County, and he's been holistically managing a herd of cattle there on their land to help bring that back. And we're hoping Aaron will call us back. It looks like we lost the call. So please do call us at 415-663-8492 and, give us some of your thoughts. And on the show, we all have our own opinions, and we want to hear your opinions and thoughts. Personally, my opinion, as you might guess, being on the Farm and Food Shed Report, I have really positive viewpoints about how grazing can be, especially because we're living in an area where it's primarily done in a really holistic way. And we've had things like the Marine Carbon Project here, doing research on how properly managed and grazed and composted, because they provide composted land, works for folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, how did you take this story, Robin, of the first Bundy down in Texas, and then the son up in Oregon? Can you help us understand what their grievances really are?
Well, those guys are. I don't think they're doing any favors for
they don't
for anybody.
Well.
And most of the ranchers in the community around there don't want them there. And I think it's a classic sort of age-old stance of anti-feds. The feds aren't going to tell us what to do and how to do it, and so I think that's part of the issue. And I'm getting distracted a little bit. Sorry. Yeah. So that's part of the issue. And I think that they feel like, that those public lands belong to the public. And I'm guessing that's their grievances. But the other ranchers don't agree with that. And what actually happened there was over a management practice that BLM, the family that owns the ranch got in trouble over how they were handling fire management. And they got, a pretty hefty sentence for doing a backburn on a couple of acres when fire was approaching
But they
them.
want it to go back to being free grazing for everybody the way it was
the Bundy
before
group,
1947, right?
Yeah, and so the Bundy group wants it like that.
Before there was any grazing act or anything.
I think we've got a caller.
We do. Hi, caller. You're on the air. What's your name, please?
This is Nicolette Nyman.
Hi, Nicolette.
Hi there.
So, Nicolette wrote the book Defending Beef, and she is a rancher here at BN Ranch in our area in Northern California. And you wrote the book Defending Beef, which has a lot of great research in it. So we were talking about grazing on public lands and pros and cons on why there are these issues, and maybe you can bring something to the conversation around that.
Well, the reason I called in was because I just wanted to say, my background is actually as an environmental lawyer. And I did write the book largely because of my own frustration that a lot of the environmental community has a very oversimplified view about ranching and cattle and the environmental impact and just this whole idea of, sort of welfare, cowboys and so forth. And I just was having a conversation earlier today with someone where I said, I think that part of the reason you're seeing incidents like this thing that happened in Oregon, which very few ranchers would ever condone that or ever do anything like that. And yet there was more sympathy for those people than you might imagine in terms of just general feeling of, well, I understand their frustration. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
And I think a lot of that stems out of, yes, problematic interactions dealing with, various federal agencies and so forth. And I have talked for hours about the stories I've heard, and I understand that frustration. But the other aspect of it that I see is that there's been this singular message coming from so many quarters of the environmental community for the last couple of decades, which is largely urban and suburban based today. And that is that basically the less meat that we have in the food system, the better, and the fewer animals we have in the landscape, the better. And that is very hostile to these people that are raising livestock for a living, and therefore they are rightly feeling defensive.
But they're defensive against the government, not against environmentalists, right?
No, what I'm saying is that they do have problematic, difficult interactions many times with various agencies that they have to deal with. But there's also this drumbeat. I mean, it's just I can hardly pick up a magazine or a newspaper or look at a website without seeing something telling people that animals, especially cattle, are damaging to the environment. Okay? And I can tell you from having worked on this for the last 15 years, first as an environmental lawyer full-time for an environmental organization, that I do understand that perspective, but I also know that perspective is radically oversimplified and largely inaccurate. But the message that's being said over and over again is that cattle are bad, okay? And so what I'm saying is they are rightly feeling on their heels.
Nicolette, this is Bernie. I was wondering, do you think what BLM is tasked with has gotten more and more complex? I mean, I know originally there was a Grazing Act, Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, but they also have to obviously deal with the National Environmental Policy Act of 69, the Endangered Species Act of 73, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 76, the Public Rangelands Improvement Act of 78. I can imagine that their job is quite complex.
Well, I think that's true, but I mean, unfortunately, we live in a society today where things are complex in terms of laws and regulations, and that's true for anybody that's operating in any sphere, any sector of business or industry. But I think what's more problematic is that people just kind of people that are working for these large federal agencies often don't have good one-on-one dealings and interactions with the people that are actually out on the land.
So it's basically the classic sort of dealing with bureaucracy is never a pleasant thing to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The exact same thing that many of us have probably experienced when we're trying to deal with something to do with our health insurance.
Well, Nicolette, we've got a couple of other callers calling in. I want to really thank you so much for calling in. And as someone who believes that what you're doing, Defending Beef, is a really informative book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicolette.
Bye-bye.
Hi, caller.
Hello. Hi, it's Aaron again.
Hi, Aaron. Sorry we lost you.
Yeah, I picked up the phone in the office and it died immediately.
So, one of the things that you and I have talked about before, and Aaron is the owner of Holistic Ag, where you're running cattle at Pepperwood Preserve in Sonoma County. They hired you to do it for restoration purposes.
Well, yeah, we're in a partnership with a scientific conservation organization, which is, traditionally, the legacy is that conservation and agriculture have been at odds ends for forever. And but the background is really I started the business to do this, to actually provide to what I call providing megafauna disturbance to land-based organizations that have no agricultural aspirations. So,
that's a mouthful.
Yeah, exactly. You can imagine how it's taking off in the Twitter.
There's not enough room.
You used all your characters up.
Wait, I've got more. No. So what's funny to me, and there's a reason why I'm in a partnership with a private operating foundation and not on public land, and that is that the public lands are subject to so many more stakeholders. So you have, first they'll say it's public opinion. Then it's really the ranchers that have these legacy grazing leases on that land. And then it's balancing also the agenda of the stewardship aspect of those organizations. And what we're at an interesting, I think we're at a turning point. And what's going on right now is we're on this land because there is not enough wildlife to manage the biomass. So we experienced some pretty significant extinction events about 10,000 years ago. Coincidentally, started agriculture at the same time. And so what our background is relative to grazing is that too many animals cause destruction. And what we're starting to understand is we don't have enough animals, but it's the management of those animals.
And that's what these federal agencies, especially the BLM, that's their job, is it not, to make sure that we don't overgraze the commons like we once did?
Exactly. But unfortunately, the scientific community has come to an intermediate, inaccurate assumption. And that is that it's the amount of animals. What it is actually, it's not the animals' fault. It's humans' fault. And
yes.
It's us removing all predation and letting the animals scatter around. The scientific community has said, put less animals on the land, that will fix it, and that's actually degraded it more. And so what we do here is we mimic nature. We use electric fencing.
Oh, and that's part of nature, electric fencing?
That's our short-faced bear. Or our dire wolf,
okay,
or our saber-toothed cat. And so what's happened is we've bred this species of animal, these cows. We've bred their herding instinct out of their psyche because they don't have that pressure. When we put that pressure back on them, they remember it quickly. Within no time at all, they know they want to be. It's like, I want you between me and the cat. You just have to be the second slowest when you're in a herd, as opposed to when you're alone, you get picked off. And so because we don't have wolves yet to throw out there, we have electric fencing, and that way we can actually limit the exposure of the animals to the grass to a specific time period at a specific density, and then move them when we want to. And what that allows us to do is mimic when we used to have so much wildlife. If you look at the work of Breck Parkman, who's the state archaeologist, and he's the one who found the mammoth rubbing rocks up in the Sonoma coast. He paints a picture of the Farallon Plain, which basically extended from Cloverdale down to San Benito, 20 kilometers west of the gate. So you can imagine a gigantic plain with a huge, with the Sacramento River coming down through where the gate is, and having more wildlife than the African Serengeti.
Wow.
In just that valley. And if you look at Google Earth and you zoom out and you look at what that represents, you can kind of see the picture of it if you really imagine. And then you look at the Big Valley in California. You can imagine how much wildlife was here. Mammoths and camels, and just it was science fiction.
Well, Aaron, we got to get to some more callers, and we want to thank you so much for calling in. And that's a really interesting picture. How do we go back to using modern technology to creating those kinds of circumstances where the land was being managed as Mother Nature would have it?
Well, why can't we bring the wolves back?
Well,
we can't.
We are.
We don't have the balance. But
yeah.
If we could probably get there if we use our agricultural livestock as a proxy and back as I say, we're in a cul-de-sac of civilization. So just throwing wolves into the suburbs is not going to fix it. We broke it too bad. It's our obligation to tease our way out of this mess we've created unconsciously and unintentionally over 10,000 years. Mm-hmm. And that's what we do up here at Pepperwood.
Great.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks so much for giving us the information about what you guys are doing there.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Aaron.
Bye-bye.
So that is, I'm kind of seeing it working around here. Aaron's certainly doing wonderful work with Alan Savory's techniques of higher grazing densities and then moving them off the land, let the grass grow back, and then bring them back in.
Which is what would have happened. They would have been being herded by wolves.
Which is what wildebeest and all those used to do in Africa, right? I mean, that's where it all started from.
Hi, caller. You're on the air. What's your name, please?
Huey Johnson.
Yeah, hi, Huey. Could you make sure your radio's down?
Yeah, turn down the radio, would you? Yeah.
Hi, Huey. So let us know what you think about this issue of the grazing on public lands.
Yes, I'm a student of public land and have managed a lot of it. I was on the governor's cabinet. California's environment one time at Jerry Brown. And I've done a lot. I've studied graduate school, this stuff. And what my basic concern is there's 200 million acres of public land grazing cattle, as we talk, in the various western states, including California. And the BLM charges $1.35 per animal unit per month.
Right.
And the economic value is about $20. Mm-hmm. So the taxpayers make up the difference. And if you take the poor urban districts of Los Angeles, the Hispanic communities, they can't afford schools. They have no grass in their playgrounds. They have no trees in their streets. And we can't afford one thing or another. But the taxpayers have every right to say, gee whiz, why don't we start somehow charging a fair fee for grazing, whether on public lands. And we charge for forests. If you go cut trees in a U.S. Forest Service land, you pay a fee. If you pump oil out of state lands, the company pays for the oil, but the taxpayers pay for grazing on public lands. There's no profit whatsoever at $1.35.
Huey, is that probably not analogous in lots of ways? I bet that those who are getting the mineral rights, getting the oil rights, getting the use of the land for renewable energy, solar plants and wind farms, and you name it. I mean, the federal government leases out the land for many uses. I would suspect, I'm not disagreeing with you, I think they're undervaluing the usage of that public land. I think they probably do it across the board. So I'm not sure this is the only example. Would you agree that there's a broader issue there?
Well, the tragedy is the land is overgrazed. If you don't charge anything for it, it just gets abused by nature. We have that example at Point Reyes on the seashore. There's grazing going on, but only a fraction of the rent is paid, and so they've got twice as many cows there as they were supposed to have because they make twice as much money. But it is, at the same time, the public asset of great importance. There's 2 acres in the public lands for every citizen in America, and they don't get anything back for it. So I'm just arguing the economic sector. We have to have a healthy landscape. I like the story of this fellow at Pepperwood. And that kind of thinking, that kind of management is going to be very positive for the country. Some politician is going to pick this up one of these times and should and will make a major issue of it. But anyway, public grazing should be done, could be done, and be wonderful if it were done properly.
And that's kind of the issue, Huey, what you're saying is a lot of people call it welfare ranching. I know Mark Dowie dropped off a copy of a great book called Welfare Ranching, The Subsidized Destruction of the American West, that one of the issues is if it's so cheap for them and we as taxpayers are subsidizing, it doesn't even give them the incentive to consider doing best practices in some cases. Is that what you're saying? Because it's so cheap.
That's a good point, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's cheap by any standard because
Yeah.
I've been told that if you're on your private ranch land, it's a lot costlier if you bring all the real costs into bear. But something I learned that I didn't know before is all of these ranchers that are getting permitted to use the public lands, they have to have their own base ranch. In
They're
other words,
they're mostly big ag, we would call it. They're mostly big corporations who bought up land around BLM land, public lands, so that they could get grazing permits, for next to nothing. That's,
And they, too, want to make sure that sort of their rights continue and that not other people come in and sort of want their use of that land. Because there's competing uses of the land. Grazing is one, and it's maybe less harmful than others even. One alternative might be the idea of just letting nature have it and keeping human development of all sorts out. I think that would be the biggest return on investment.
And Huey, what did you see in the work that you were doing around land management? Is one of the issues a lot of the political issues with a bureaucratic situation?
I don't believe there has been ample notice. There's a group called the Western Senators, and in Congress, and they make sure the rules never change and the fees never increase. Politics being what it is, they then get nice contributions back from the ranchers.
Wow.
Paid adequate income.
Well, that's not shocking, I guess. Huey, thank you so much for calling. I think we've got another caller on the line.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Huey.
Bye, Huey.
Yes, this is Donica Markegard of our family grass-fed.
Hi,
Donica.
Donica.
Hi. You're kind of breaking up. Are you on speaker?
No, I'm not. I'm just
Oops.
forest program with my kids. I just kind of ducked out for a little bit.
Oh, there you go. We can hear you now.
Okay.
So, Donica, you're doing wonderful holistic ranching down south of us. Can you give us some of your feedback about the issues about grazing on public lands and in general, kind of what your philosophy is of what you guys are doing?
Yeah, well, we graze both in Sonoma County and San Mateo County. And the parks that we graze are just out.
Donica, for some reason your phone is breaking up. I know you're out on a wilderness day with the kids, aren't you?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
Stay right there.
Don't move.
We graze cattle both in Sonoma County and San Mateo County. And the conservation organizations that we work with on the lands are getting ready to open up a couple of our grazing lands open to the public. So I know there's a lot of public process that goes into that, a lot of input from different stakeholder groups. So it's just sort of part of the evolution of shared open space, and I think folks just need to be educated on the benefits of grazing, holistically managed grazing, and agriculture, preservation of agriculture, and family ranching, and also the potential for cattle to mimic what the native grazers did on these lands when managed properly. So these grasslands evolved with grazers, and if we aren't able to bring back the elk, then we can manage our cattle in the way the elk evolved with the grasslands.
And it sounds like because you're not working with BLM or a huge organization, you're getting more integrated feedback back and forth, and they're having more oversight and seeing that you are doing it correctly.
It's a partnership.
Yeah. Which I'm thinking would be very difficult with what's going on in the great western areas where BLM and the Forest Service are managing. That it's sort of the difference between smaller sustainable ag and big ag.
Well, yeah,
local and industrial, yes.
Yeah.
Is anyone doing any holistic ag work with any of these guys out in the Great Basin ranches where the huge ranches are? Do you know?
I don't know. Do you know of any of that, Donica?
Yeah, it's all over the world, but right here where we are is what I'm mostly familiar with is, and we work with mainly regional parks and land trusts. So they're local government or private land trusts. And so I'm not familiar with working with any federal agencies.
Well, I think you're on the right track, because I believe that if we manage everything locally, we'd certainly
closer
be
to
better.
home.
Yes,
Yeah.
where we all look each other in the eye and we find the compromises on a more person-to-person level than running it through the Congress.
Well, Donica, thank you so much for taking time out of your wilderness day with the kids.
Yeah, thank you, Robin.
Okay, I think we've got another caller. It's really interesting. Hopefully, Mark Dowie will get a chance to call in a little later, because he actually grew up in the Great Wild West, and I think on a ranch, and has had his family dealt with BLM and Forest Service, and they're now on Crow Reservation land dealing with. So that's who they deal with. But it does sound, what we're hearing is, when you're dealing with something that's more local, smaller, where there's that immediate feedback and where there's that transparency of management practices, it really does translate. It sounds like, from what's going on in the Great West with BLM and the others, it's like big ag. Yeah. Even if some of those ranchers have been there 5 generations and they're not big ag, the majority are, and you're dealing with this large bureaucratic system that doesn't seem to really, not to put the feds down, but sometimes they're not really looking at what is the best use of that land.
Well, it's a hierarchical organization. I know that within BLM, there are a lot of good people who want to preserve and do the job of conservation.
Especially in the field, guys who are out there doing the work out there.
Yeah.
But I mean, we look at BLM, and Bernie and I were talking about this earlier. They've done things like they're allowing fracking on public lands. They're allowing, so it feels like they are public lands, and the public's sort of divorced a lot from what we'd like to see happening to our public lands.
Well, so they are not in the actual business. Their bailiwick is to use the resources of the public lands, like the Forest Service does. They're not in the business of actually...
They're in the business of making money off of the
forests.
public lands, I guess.
Exactly. They want to cut the trees down and put more in and cut them down again.
So it's interesting why this concept, or why this thing that they're doing called welfare ranching. Is that because the big guys came in, and that's why the head price lowered per month?
Well, sure. I mean, I don't see it any different than the farm subsidies that are handed out for corn and soy. And it's big ag that are the beneficiaries. Even some of the members of Congress are getting big checks because they own a farm, and then they vote in this subsidy. So that kind of welfare that is industry specific, I believe, happens in so many industries, and I think it obviously happens in cattle, and it's in the interests of the ranchers to keep those fees low. It's in the interests maybe of people, environmentalists, to raise them up. And so that dialogue, but what is our electoral process for these states? I think it's like most states, the big interests control the elections until recently anyway.
And most of these cattle are going to end up in feedlot. We're talking here in this.
Our cattle goes from the grass to the slaughterhouse. We're not putting them in, and the big. So that's a secondary negative if they're improperly using the land and degrading the land, and then secondarily if they're going to these feedlot operations. That's where you get all the damage, the negative things about cattle, the methane release and the antibiotics used because they're getting sick eating the grain those last few months. And so...
Are those really those... I have a nice image of being a cowboy and herding cattle, and I think of them as being grass-fed out there. Do they end up at a CAFO before they go to the slaughterhouse?
I'm guessing a lot of these guys are conventional ranchers, and all cattle are, until the last maybe, say, 6 months, are grass-fed. They're being run somewhere, and then they get put into the CAFOs the last few months. Right. I think we've got a caller.
Hi, caller. You're on your air. What's the name, please?
My name is Chen.
Hi, Chen.
Hi. I was just kind of calling in, listening to some of these issues. I know I do a little bit of studying of land and wildlife policy, both local and other areas in the western United States, which is where most of the cattle is run, on public lands, of course. I think one thing that I wouldn't want to have polarized between the environmental community and special interests that are allowed to run cattle on public lands is the notion that cattle are necessarily inherently bad. I think that management, as some of the other callers have said can be bad, but that cattle aren't necessarily bad. But one of the issues with this management, especially on public lands, is the wide range of issues that cattle cause. One thing that we're not talking about on the call necessarily is water use, especially in the arid West. On some of these desert lands where precipitation is less than 10 inches a year,
right.
We're definitely seeing some degradation to the natural landscape, issues with soil erosion, soil infiltration. The systems are thrown out of whack a little bit because of these issues, and it's on a larger scale. It also, comes into contact with water pollution. So it's like a double whammy on water.
And in nature, they wouldn't stay in an area where there was no water. They would move out of that area, but because they're owned, that's not happening, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right, and another issue is the subsidies are promoting certain irrigation systems within public lands. We're talking about a wide variety of designated landscapes, where BLM land, national park land, and then preserves and regional parks as well. So there's a variety of landscapes. So there's a wide range of scopes and scales at which cattle are ran. But yeah, irrigation, there's a number of issues. And I know you mentioned the issue of methane too. Methane is going to be an issue everywhere with regard to cattle, but it definitely varies depending on their feed too. So.
And there's disruption of wildlife that's still there. The sage grouse is endangered, partly because of grazing on
right.
On
well, that's another issue too. Yeah, on public lands, there's people advocating for wise use or encroachment of special interests, and that could be a wide variety of special interests. We're specifically talking about grazing, but of course you've mentioned natural gas leases and oil leases and mineral rights that are still in control, even on national park lands under the ground. But yeah, the preservation of wildlife and biological diversity is so key, and
yep.
It's overlooked.
On that point, I know there was an effort on the ranchers to extend the grazable area where there were native grasses that the cattle didn't like, or forests, pinyon, juniper, for example. They expanded the areas by trying to chain. They call chaining and seeding, where this chaining was taking an old anchor chain from a boat between two tractors and just totally ripping up the ground.
BLM is doing that.
Yeah, and then coming in with planting seeds, trying to create a new habitat that is friendly to the grazing. But man keeps doing that, and we keep underestimating the side effects that are unintended. And from what I've read is that has a short-term benefit, but not long-lasting. Long-lasting, we can't fight nature. We've got to allow that biodiversity to continue. And for me, that hope on federal lands is that that's a place we can do it. We've already destroyed the urban areas, the suburbs, and let's at least try to preserve some wilderness where nature makes the decisions and not humans in their infinite genius.
Right. My final thought on that would be this: locally, regionally, we're seeing that promotion, that concept of these are not native. They've been managed for thousands of years by Native Americans and other individuals like the ranchers who have settled here. But on public lands, there is a commitment to the concept of CPR, conservation, preservation, and restoration. And so when we're talking about natural systems and the ability for biological diversity and wildlife to flourish, we need to keep in mind that restoration is a principle, and it's costly, but in the long term, like you said, it'll pay dividends back to people who of all different values that care about those landscapes.
Chance, would you say that that's the call or the purview or the mission of BLM, or is BLM more about how do we maximize income off the resources?
I think it has to be level for BLM. There's lots of money that goes into the Land and Water Conservation Fund that comes from off offshore oil. There's lots of money that goes back to taxpayers from wise use of the landscapes in terms of timber and natural resources. But at the end of the day, there has to be that voice for wildlife and wilderness protection and ecological sustainability, and not just economic sustainability on those landscapes.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank
very
you
much.
for your insight.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having this call.
Great call. Thanks.
You know, it's an interesting thought from what Chance was talking about, that a third of the world's land mass is meant to be, or is grasslands. And like what we're talking about, they're grazing cattle in areas that never were and are not meant to be grasslands. But then we've got in the great Midwest, all of that monocrop corn, those were meant to be grasslands.
Right.
That's where we should be, running cattle and bison and filling it up and getting rid of all those crops. It's how we got the Dust Bowl, stripping the topsoil off and that kind of thing. So looking at what was this land meant to be, how can we assist, that happening, and also looking at, we do want to produce food, we do want to do things. So where are ways and how are ways we can do it that fits into wanting to, as Chance was saying, to restore and preserve.
You're so right. I mean, I've shown comparisons where in the East or the Midwest more than the West, the amount or the water is more available, obviously, and the land can support many more animals before it's degraded than it can in the far West.
Like the high desert, yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of bison and wildlife, I saw that article somewhere that they're going to kill
900 bison.
900 bison from Yellowstone before they leave the park, so that they don't mess with the ranchers in Wyoming, Montana.
And see, that's one of the issues too, where we have got to be really. The one thing about our clever monkey brains and clever selves that's messed up the planet. The other thing is when we're in trouble, as Dr. Jane Goodall said, a primate is at its best when it's cornered and has to focus and do the right thing. And we kind of are. And so we have to look at how are you going to have that kind of thing coexist? How are you going to have we're having the issue with the Tule elk, So how do you, first of all, do we need more wolves in Yellowstone? Do we need some more do we need more predators? And how do you deal with predation? How do ranchers, instead of it being one side wins over the other, we've got to collaborate.
And we are accomplices in demanding that our food be cheap. We want cheap beef. And so we're all part of that system where the ranchers feel squeezed, where they can't really afford a lot in order to make a living. Can we imagine if the beef sold at 100 times what it sells now, how much more sustainably the pressure would be off?
We're the prime example of it here. I'm going to pay $10 a pound for ground beef from Bean Ranch or Stemple Creek or one of our wonderful grass-fed beef providers, but I don't mind. It means I'm going to maybe eat less beef, but it's available and it's good, and and because of the area we live in, all of these folks are able to sell their grass-fed lamb and beef and those kinds of things, because people here understand that if you are going to eat meat, you should be eating meat. You should only, my opinion is, you should only be eating meat that is properly, humanely, and ecologically soundly raised. Right. And that's, one of the issues around, don't eat meat. It's like, first of all, we need to not eat anything that's not raised correctly. Don't eat conventional corn that tore up the Great Plains of the Midwest. So
well, and fortunately, we have folks here that are affluent enough and understanding enough that do what you're saying. Unfortunately, though, McDonald's is the major restaurant in the world, and I confess, I ate at McDonald's. You can say, well, what are you doing that for?
Don't tell everybody that.
Well, I admit it. I'm sort of hooked on industrial food, and I don't think it's good. I'm not promoting it. I'm not saying everyone should.
Yeah.
I'm just admitting that I'm victim or participating in this process. And I know that they cause destruction of rainforests in the Amazon. And how horrible is that? So it's all in proportion. And so
I think we've got a caller.
Yeah. So I just let me close with I'm clearly an omnivore, and I understand the people that go vegan, and I think they think that we can solve the problem. I think it would go a long way if we all ate less meat, no question. So, hi, caller. What's your name, please? You're on the air.
Ken and Kathy Lindner.
Hi, Kenan.
Oh, hi. This is Ken and Kathy. They raise bison.
Aha.
Oh, how cool.
So I don't know, Kathy, if you and Ken have been able to hear some of the show, but we've been talking about, grazing on public lands and what is good management of livestock and what is poor management. And I would love to hear a little bit about what you guys are doing and what it's like raising the bison.
Oh, thanks, Robin. Well, unfortunately, we couldn't hear the show because we're up here in Lassen County. But for us, we don't do public grazing with bison. Typically, they migrate, so they're not very good candidates for that.
Yeah.
Agree?
Yeah. This is Ken. Basically, we use all deeded land that we pay taxes on.
Rotational grazing.
And one of the reasons why typically you can't put bison on public lands is that they require good fencing to keep them restrained. Otherwise, they're just going to wander off.
And how do you guys deal with having these very large migratory animals, and kind of do you herd them around to sort of keep them in areas, or how does that work?
Robin, that's an excellent question. We do get asked that a lot. Ironically, these animals, and we joke about this, they are less maintenance than our chickens.
Wow.
Wow.
Literally, we do it completely hands-off. We do not handle them. We don't wean. We just don't do anything. They stay together in family groups. And so there's a very strong family, what would you call it?
Well, we give them a good home.
Yeah.
They don't want to go anywhere.
There's no reason for them to migrate because they have the food and the water and their family group all the time. So they don't need to go off looking for it.
So you're in collaboration with them then?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We wanted to mimic what nature would do. And so all we do is we provide a fence and the water and the grass, of course, hay in the winter, and, respect what they naturally would do. And they would stay in a family group. They would stay in a herd group. And so all of these animals know each other. We've got our 3 matriarchal cows that are now 22 years old. Wow. 2 of them had calves last year. So,
wow,
they're happy.
They are happy, fertile older ladies.
Well, and they're 100% grass fed too, and we don't do any handling. We have no handling facility. So, for example, to do deworming, we use diatomaceous earth, and we just mix it in the hay with a little bit of molasses, and they love it.
Nice.
Cool.
I'm curious, you guys probably knew Devin Strong, who was doing bison?
Yes. Well, we've certainly had a dialogue with him on Facebook and really respected, how he was honoring the native tradition.
Because they sound very similar. I mean, Devin was running his bison in terms of, or as Native Americans would, so sort of living alongside them. Very similarly, well, he was very based in Lakota tradition and biodynamic tradition, but it sounds very similar to what you're doing, which is basically providing a good home and keeping a good relationship with your bison.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm curious, this is Bernie, is there a good market? Are you able to make a living at selling bison's meat?
That's a good question, too. Believe it or not, we've had these animals now for almost 20 years, and from the very beginning, there was more demand than there is supply. That is still true today.
Good.
We could probably sell, 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, easily.
Wow.
While that's good, we're just not big enough. We don't ever want to be so big that it it infringes on the quality of life for them, our quality of life, our principles. We don't want to be cutting any corners. And judging from commercialization, that seems to be the first thing that happens when you start going into volume.
Would you encourage other ranchers who might be running traditional cattle to switch to bison?
Always. We absolutely do. Probably the biggest challenge will be the expense of the fencing, but once that is in place, at least that's our perspective. Once that's in place, these animals are more efficient grazers. They take a third less water. The meat, of course, is absolutely amazing. And if you Google us, you'll see all kinds of wonderful testimonials online.
What would we Google, or what is your website?
Just Lindner Bison, Lindner Bison.
Great.
Yeah.
LinderBison.com.
Oh, thanks, Ken.
One of the reasons that, and I'll just throw this in, that we believe that raising bison is such a good idea is the difference is these animals evolved on this continent. So the weather here, the climate, the storms, the heat, the cold, everything that the climate throws at them, they are equipped to handle, which may not be the case with other animals that have not evolved on this continent.
Yeah, they came from Europe, did they not, the other cattle?
The cattle.
Yeah, most of them from Europe, either England or Germany. And then now there's quite a number of lines also from more subcontinent areas like India.
It's interesting because several years ago I had Devin on my Farm and Food Shed show, and in the biodynamic tradition there's certain rituals you do, and one is you put certain herbs and things in a cow horn and bury it as part of a ritual. And Devin was able to get, I guess the biodynamic thing is based out of England, and he was able to get them to accept that in America it should be changed to be using a bison horn because cattle are European and bison are our grazing animals as North America.
Well, and that's absolutely true. And boy, we sure miss him already.
Yeah, he passed away recently.
Yes. He really carried forward a lot of these new awarenesses that we're all, kind of waking up to, and that's one of them.
I had a quick question for you. We were talking a little bit earlier about how I think it's in Yellowstone they want to eliminate 900 bison or a herd of bison they have there because they're getting into areas where the cattle are.
They're going to leave the park in the spring, and they don't want them to.
They don't want them to migrate.
Cattle grazing areas,
right? And we get asked that a lot. That's a real. It's a hot potato in many ways. I was raised in Montana. It was always an issue with the ranchers. Now that we're bison producers, what we understand is that when they are survivors, if they run out of food, they're going to go looking for food. So naturally, they migrate. That's part of the migratory survival pattern. So that's natural. It's predictable that they would leave. As far as taking 900 off, for the health of the herd, it probably needs to be culled, and however that culling takes place, whether they sell the animals and then they're sent to slaughter, whether they do a field harvest, yes, a certain number will need to be culled, otherwise they will overgraze the park.
So
I don't know what the caretakers are doing up there, but there are a lot of special interest groups that really fan this flame, and I'm not sure if it's in the best interest of the bison, for example.
And
question.
If so much of those lands, those public lands, are subsidized and it's so cheap for the cattle, why don't we as the public push back and say we'd like to see people switch over to bison, so that you take those, it's 367,000 square miles of public land. We could have a heck of a lot of bison in good, happy habitat. And
as long as we didn't build a lot of fences and put them in small spaces so that individuals, again, could profit. I mean, that's the problem, I think, is that the idea of fencing off into smaller lots throughout the West is not something.
But if there's that demand, why not give additional subsidies for those cattle folks to do bison. But I guess as Bernie was saying, and you guys are saying, Kathy and Ken, it's such a completely different mindset to manage bison than cattle.
Well, it's a hands-off thing. And, I mean, they're really, I mean, when we say hands-off, we mean hands-off. And we're not cattle producers, so we can't really speak to that. But the bison was and is being considered to be declared the national mammal, which we do encourage people to support.
Thanks,
cool.
Kathy and Ken. We just realized we looked at the clock. We're out of time. Thank you so much for calling.
Great call. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So I'd like to thank our callers. Robin, how'd you feel about how today went?
I think we had some interesting discussions. It's so complex. I think we could just talk about what they call kind of the iron triangle of large ag, cattle folks, government,
big government,
the money coming in. It's really a fascinating topic, and there's so much possibility for it to be completely better and different.
I'm impressed that you knew every caller before they introduced themselves. Very good job getting everybody to call.
Well, I put the call out to all the folks I knew doing it the right way to get their feedback. And thanks to Chance and Huey and the others calling in with their feedback, too.